There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable.
Buckingham Palace has just confirmed something they could not hold back any longer. And what's been happening behind closed doors around King Charles's health is far more serious, complicated, and far more emotionally loaded than the headlines suggest. Most people have only caught fragments of this story, but there's a bigger picture here, one involving a reigning monarch, a diagnosis nobody anticipated, and a palace machinery working overtime to manage what this actually means. This is the heartbreaking news about King Charles's health battle that Buckingham Palace can no longer contain. It started with something almost ordinary. On January 17, 2024, Buckingham Palace quietly confirmed that King Charles would undergo a corrective procedure for a benign enlarged prostate. Routine, manageable, the kind of announcement that barely registers beyond a single news cycle. He checked into the London clinic on January 26th. Sources say nobody inside the palace was particularly alarmed. And then something else was found. During that procedure, sources say the medical team noticed a separate issue entirely, something that had nothing to do with the prostate, something that required a different conversation, a different set of specialists, a different timeline. Within days of that January admission, diagnostic tests were run, and what those tests identified changed everything about the early years of Charles III's reign. By February 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed it officially. The king had been diagnosed with cancer. Now here is what makes that timing genuinely staggering. Charles had ascended to the throne in September 2022. He was barely 18 months into a kingship he had waited 7 decades to hold. The coronation was still less than a year behind him, and suddenly his medical team was mapping a treatment schedule around an illness the palace would deliberately refuse to name. Sources suggest this was not a slow-building story that insiders had quietly braced for. This was accidental discovery. A door opened during one procedure that led directly into another, much darker room. The palace statement itself acknowledged it plainly. A separate issue of concern was noted. That clinical language, sources say, was carrying an enormous weight, which raises the question nobody inside the palace had a clean answer for in those first days of February 2024. If the discovery was accidental, what else might still be waiting to be found? That question drove the most consequential decision Charles would make, whether to tell the world at all. And here is where the story pivots completely, because the accidental discovery forced a decision no British monarch had faced in living memory. Not just what to do medically, but whether to admit the diagnosis existed at all. Sources say the palace spent days in genuine internal conflict. Centuries of royal tradition pointed one way. Medical matters stay private, full stop. The institution had buried health crises before, managed optics through careful silence and well-timed appearances. That playbook was still available. Charles chose to discard it entirely. On February 5, 2024, Buckingham Palace confirmed the king had been diagnosed with a form of cancer. That single sentence broke something that had held for generations. But here is what the palace deliberately withheld: the cancer type, the stage, the specific treatment, the prognosis. Sources suggest the statement was engineered to confirm just enough to prevent a leak from doing it first, while sealing off every detail that would invite real medical scrutiny. So the public received a confirmation wrapped around a void. The official justification was framed almost generously. Charles did not wish to speak to his own condition, but rather to every person affected by cancer. Sources close to the decision describe that framing as genuine, but it also, quietly, served the institution perfectly. What it created was a nation that knew their king was ill, but had no idea how ill. And that gap, sources suggest, is where everything that follows actually lives. So the public now knew their king was sick. What they didn't know, what nobody outside the inner circle knew, was what came next. And what came next moved fast. On February 5, 2024, Buckingham Palace released a second statement, precise, controlled, almost clinical in tone. It confirmed that Charles had commenced, in their exact words, a schedule of regular treatments, and that doctors had advised him to postpone all public-facing duties immediately. That single sentence restructured the British monarchy overnight. Now, postponing public duties sounds administrative, bureaucratic even. But what happened behind those palace walls in the weeks that followed was genuinely significant. A king who had previously carried out roughly 500 public engagements per year, overseas visits, investitures, ceremonial appearances, private audiences, was suddenly withdrawn completely from public view. Not scaled back, withdrawn. But here is what the palace was careful to clarify. Charles did not stop being king. State paperwork continued. Constitutional documents still crossed his desk. The red boxes kept arriving. Sources close to the operation describe it as a deliberate bifurcation, separating the visible monarchy from the functioning one and quietly sustaining the latter while the former went dark. And that restructuring required coordination that most people never saw. Duties were redistributed. Schedules were quietly rebuilt around one man's treatment calendar. The institution reorganized itself around an illness it still refused to name, which raises the question nobody was publicly asking at the time. If the treatment was progressing, if the paperwork was flowing, if the machinery of monarchy was still running, why, more than a year later, would things get dramatically worse? Because sources suggest that by early 2025, what looked like a managed situation was about to become something far more alarming, something that required an emergency response. What sources were carefully not saying through those months of managed calm was that the treatment calendar was masking something increasingly unstable underneath. March 2025. That is when the situation broke open. Sources close to the palace describe what happened that month as a serious escalation, not a scheduled adjustment, not a precautionary step, but an unexpected hospitalization that moved fast and alarmed the people closest to Charles. The specific details of what triggered it have never been officially confirmed, but sources suggest the decision to admit him was made quickly, without the usual buffer of palace communications preparing the public narrative in advance. That absence of preparation is itself telling. When the palace has time, it manages the message. This time, sources say, there wasn't time. What does that actually mean for a man who had been described publicly as responding well to treatment? It means the response was never as clean as the language implied. A year of outwardly managed illness had not stabilized the underlying condition as firmly as anyone had hoped. His medical team had been monitoring developments that were not being reflected in public-facing statements. The emergency response involved a rapid assessment of his condition and, according to sources, a frank internal conversation about the trajectory of his treatment. Not a reassessment of whether he would recover, a reassessment of what recovery was realistically supposed to look like. Because here is the question that hospitalization quietly forced into the open. If things were being managed, if the institution had reorganized itself around exactly this kind of sustained long-term illness, why did March 2025 still catch people off guard? Sources suggest the answer is simple. Because the gap between a stable treatment schedule and an actually stable condition is far wider than the palace's language ever acknowledged. The machinery had been running. The man at the center of it had been genuinely fragile the entire time. That distinction between the institution functioning and the king improving is exactly the gap that palace communications worked hardest to close over. The March hospitalization briefly made it impossible to ignore. Which brings you to the question the palace has still never directly answered. Is King Charles actually getting better? Or is this simply the new permanent state? Because those two things are not the same. Now here is the question that cuts through everything the palace has carefully constructed. Charles is not in remission. Sources close to his medical team have been explicit about this distinction, even if Buckingham Palace has never once used that word publicly, and the silence around it is not accidental. It is, sources suggest, completely deliberate. What the palace confirmed in its carefully worded updates was never recovery. It was management. There is a meaningful medical difference between a patient who has beaten cancer and a patient who is living alongside it, and every communication out of the palace has quietly, consistently described the latter, while allowing the public to hear the former. So what does scaling back treatment actually mean? Because it sounds like good news, and in one narrow sense, it is. When oncologists reduce treatment intensity, it can indicate that the disease is no longer advancing at the pace it once was. But, and this is the part that gets lost, it does not mean the cancer is gone. It does not mean the cancer will not return. It means the immediate aggressive phase has shifted into something longer, quieter, and in many cases permanent. Sources suggest Charles is in what oncologists would describe as a chronic management phase, not a cure, a livable condition monitored continuously, adjusted as needed. The goal is not eradication, it is stability. That distinction matters enormously for everything that follows, for how the palace structures its schedule, for how long William remains in a state of preparation rather than succession, for how Buckingham Palace manages a reign that may be defined by endurance rather than recovery. And here is the part that I find genuinely striking. The palace has never once said he will beat this. They have said he is receiving treatment. They have said he is in good spirits. They have said he is grateful. But the word remission has never appeared in a single official statement. That is not an oversight. That is the truth hiding in plain sight, which immediately raises a question the institution has been quietly preparing for since February 2024. If Charles cannot return to full capacity, how does the crown actually function? Because someone has been making those decisions. And that is not a hypothetical question anymore. The answer has been quietly unfolding inside the palace since February 2024 through a series of structural adjustments so carefully managed that most people never registered them as what they actually were. Not administrative reshuffling, deliberate constitutional preparation. The redistribution started immediately. When Charles suspended public-facing duties, those roughly 500 annual engagements didn't simply disappear. Sources suggest they were methodically absorbed by William and Catherine, by Princess Anne, by a working royal rotation that was assembled with more precision than anyone publicly acknowledged. Individual diary entries, ceremonial appearances, diplomatic receptions, each reassigned quietly, without announcement, without explanation, nothing individually alarming, everything collectively significant. But the logistical rebalancing is only half the story, because beyond the public schedule, sources say the palace placed specific constitutional mechanisms on standby. The Regency Act, 1937, legislation most people have never read and will hopefully never need, formally governs what happens if a monarch becomes incapacitated. It allows for counselors of state to act on the crown's behalf, a mechanism already expanded in 2022 to include both William and Harry, and then amended again after Harry's departure to ensure the framework actually held. Charles himself signed off on those amendments. He understood precisely why they mattered. Now, activating the full Regency framework would require a formal finding of incapacity. That threshold has not been reached, and palace sources are careful to note that. But the mechanisms are primed. The legal groundwork is complete. The infrastructure for continuity sits there, ready, which tells you something about how seriously the institution is treating this. And it raises the question that no constitutional document can actually answer. What does all of this do to the man being silently prepared to step forward? Now, this is where the story stops being institutional and becomes genuinely human, because William has known this was coming his entire life. He was born into it, but knowing something intellectually and living it in real time, watching your father sit across from you at a briefing while quietly fighting a cancer nobody will name, that is a completely different experience, and the weight of it has been accumulating in ways that are not visible from the outside. Consider what his position actually requires. He cannot show fear, because fear signals instability. He cannot appear eager, because eagerness signals ambition. He cannot grieve publicly, because the air grieving publicly becomes its own constitutional crisis. So he has to hold all of it internally, perform composure, and simultaneously absorb an expanding workload that nobody is officially calling a transition, but that functions as one anyway. Sources close to the palace describe William as genuinely committed to protecting his father's dignity during this period. He has, by all accounts, deliberately stayed in a supporting role, not stepping back, not stepping forward, holding. But holding costs something. By late 2024, sources suggest William had quietly taken on coordination responsibilities that would typically sit closer to the king himself. Not formal, nothing documented as a transfer of power, just the accumulated weight of being the person the institution leans toward when uncertainty enters the room. And that is perhaps the sharpest part of his impossible position. The closer Charles comes to needing the Regency framework activated, the more William has to be ready. But the more ready he visibly becomes, the more it looks like he's already ruling. So he waits, prepared for everything, permitted to show nothing. The question now is whether the latest medical update gave him any reason to believe the waiting might finally be easing. Now, the question the last 7 chapters have been circling finally has an answer, or at least the closest thing to one the palace has been willing to give. In December 2025, Buckingham Palace issued a carefully worded update confirming that King Charles's treatment was being scaled back. The intensive phase, sources say, was drawing down. A precautionary monitoring period was beginning, and on the surface, that sounds like progress worth celebrating. But here is what sources close to the palace are quietly making clear. Scaled back is not finished. Precautionary is not cured, and the language in that December statement was, by every measure, deliberately measured, not triumphant, not resolved, measured. The wording was reviewed at the highest levels before release, specifically to avoid creating an impression the medical team could not stand behind. Every phrase, sources say, was chosen to communicate hope without promising what nobody can guarantee. And that gap between what the statement says and what it cannot say is where the real story lives. Because what Buckingham Palace confirmed in December 2025 is not remission, it is not recovery, it is a transition from active intensive treatment into what oncologists would recognize as a long-term management phase. The cancer has not been announced as gone. The prognosis has not been published. The type of cancer remains officially undisclosed. What the palace confirmed is that things are, cautiously, better than they were in March 2025. That is genuinely significant. It is also only half the picture. The other half involves what this phase actually cost the people closest to Charles, not institutionally, personally, because behind every carefully worded palace statement, there is a family absorbing what the public only partially understands, and what it cost them to keep carrying that weight, publicly composed, privately fractured, is a story the official updates have never once addressed. Now here is what the official language has never once captured. The word heartbreaking doesn't belong to press releases or palace statements. It belongs to the people inside the building. Sources suggest Camilla's public composure has been, quietly, one of the most sustained performances of the entire reign. At every engagement, every walkabout, every carefully timed photograph, she presents exactly what the institution requires. Steady, warm, controlled. But sources close to the household describe a private reality that is genuinely exhausting. A woman managing her husband's illness, her own public role, and the weight of a nation watching her every expression for clues. And then there are the grandchildren. The younger ones have been deliberately shielded from the full picture. They know their grandfather is unwell. They do not know what the adults in the room know. That gap between what children are told and what their parents are carrying is perhaps the most personal cost this family has paid, because what it takes to maintain a monarchy through a medical crisis of this scale is not institutional adaptation. It is people choosing day after day to absorb private grief and project public stability simultaneously, without acknowledgement. That is what heartbreaking actually means here. Not one devastating moment, a sustained, invisible weight. And the reason that weight never fully lifts is because the central question, the one that would allow this family to finally plan, finally exhale, remains unanswered. And that is the truth the palace has never fully surrendered. Throughout everything, the February 2024 announcement, the treatment schedule, the March 2025 hospitalization, the cautiously measured December update, one thing has remained completely, deliberately untouched: the cancer type, the long-term prognosis, the specific medical detail that would allow anyone outside that innermost circle to genuinely understand what Charles is facing. Sources say his closest advisors know. Sources suggest that certain members of the medical team have framed an internal picture that is far more detailed than anything ever shared publicly. But the public, the nation that has carried this alongside him, gets the managed version, always. Now, you could argue that is his right, and it is. But rights and resolutions are different things, and what this story has never produced is resolution. The cancer type remains unconfirmed. The prognosis remains unconfirmed. The one medical detail that would finally allow this family, this institution, this country to plan with any real clarity, quietly locked away, and sources say it will likely stay there. What Buckingham Palace confirmed was real. What it cost this family to confirm it was real. But what they still have not told you, and may genuinely never tell you, is whether the hardest chapter is behind them or still coming. That question has no confirmed answer, and that is precisely the point. The balance of power inside that diagnosis just shifted, but Charles hasn't won and the cancer hasn't lost. The real story was never medical. It was whether the institution survives the uncertainty. It still might not.